Okay, we're going to take one more moment and let the last of our guests arrive. Welcome, everyone. My name is Megan Price. You are here joining us with a very special presentation. I'm extremely excited to be joined today by Dylan Mathews, CEO of Peace Direct, and Shannon Paige, who is a policy officer also at Peace Direct, and who is the lead author of the report we're going to discuss today, Time to Decolonise Aid. So just to briefly set out some expectations for the day, we are going to have a quick briefing on the key terminologies, some key findings of the report. We will then move to explore with Shannon and Dylan why this report, why now, what is its impetus, what is its aims, what are its key messages. We'll delve into some of those main findings and the recommendations and what the implications of those recommendations might be. And as always, we have reserved time for public Q&A from the audience in the latter half of the session. And I'll give you guys instructions on how to participate once we reach that portion of the webinar. To repeat the House rules very quickly, please keep your mics muted until you are called upon. If you are comfortable doing so, we really welcome you to turn your camera on so that we can see who's around the table. We would invite you to rename yourself in the participants list to include your first, last name, and your organization, if you're comfortable with that. And if you want to take an extra step, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat as well. It's always nice to see who's here. With that, I'm going to take a brief moment to launch a quick poll because we are curious to hear from you among our audience, how familiar you are with the recent report, the Time to Decolonize Aid report. So please feel free to take a moment to just give us a sense of your familiarity, and that'll help our speakers gauge how much detail or explanation they need to be providing in their answers. We'll take just 5 more seconds for the completion of the poll. Excellent. Okay, so it looks like we've got a pretty general spread, with the majority not having yet had the opportunity to read the report, and then a few people having read the conclusions, the executive summary, key points, and the minority having read the full report. And I'm happy to count myself among that group as well. It's definitely worth the time investment. It's very well written and really compelling. So I very strongly encourage everyone who's here today to use the opportunity to get familiar with key messages and then take the time to go into the report. Great. With that, I'd like to go ahead and hand over to Shannon Paige. She will be providing us a quick briefing on the report itself. And once again, she's the policy associate and lead author of the report, and she leads on Peace Direct's decolonizing research and advocacy. Shannon, over to you.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you everyone so much for joining us today. So as Megan mentioned, we're here to talk about this report. This report is the culmination of many months of work that began in November of last year when we held a 3-day consultation with approximately close to 160 participants from all around the world, where we discussed what does it mean to decolonize aid and peace building. And so since then, we have supplemented those conversations from that initial consultation with other conversations that we've had at PeaceCon in December of 2020, and then subsequently we wrote this report. And so firstly, I think one thing that we emphasize in the report is the importance of language. And so to start this conversation, we wanted to make sure that everybody had a shared understanding of key definitions, key terminology, so that when we say things like decolonizing, we all are in agreement as to what we're referring to. And so in this report, and for our purposes today, we are not using the term decolonizing as it is more conventionally or colloquially used. We are using a definition that really refers to deconstructing and dismantling colonial era and neocolonial ideologies regarding the superiority of Western thought and approaches and the redistribution of power acquired during colonial times, which has continued to accumulate since. And so this definition is a little lengthy, but really what we're trying to get at is the fact that during colonial era, power dynamics were created and have afforded certain communities more power than others. And what we are in the process of doing is dismantling that, recognizing it, dismantling it, and redistributing that power so that it's more equally held. And that's what we're referring to when we're talking about decolonizing aid. It's that recognition and that dismantling and that redistribution. So I think those 3 steps are a really easy way to understand how we're approaching it. Similarly, I think the terms global north and global south are going to be used a lot today. And so I want to make sure that everybody understands what we're referring to. Global North consists of the richest and most industrialized countries, which are mainly located in the northern part of the world, though not exclusively. This is a term that really came out of incredible scholarship that was happening amongst individuals in the global south, trying to find a terminology to really encapsulate the experience of having potentially been formerly colonized or having experienced that degree of imperialism that then impacted their own industrialization and then subsequent relationship to the wider international community. So that's why global north and global south are terminologies that we at Peace Direct have decided to continue using, though we know that many people feel as though there are better terms, use different terms, but those are the ones that we use, and we wanted to make sure everyone was familiar with them as we started. And so global south, inversely, those are countries on the opposite side of the global north, global south divide. Intersectionality is a term coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who used it as a legal term really to refer to how various aspects of an individual's social and political identities could intersect to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. So for example, you could be both a person from a minoritized background due to your racial background, as well as being, a woman, and how those different identities would overlap and create new ways for you to be discriminated against or to hold privilege dependingly. So it's a vital term for us to understand as we enter this conversation. Structural or institutional racism is the system of structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantage individuals or groups on the basis of their membership to a particular racial or ethnic group. And so this is the consequence, and this is the legacy of colonialism that we are trying to decolonize. And so really understanding that those 2 things go hand in hand. Structural racism is about more than simply interpersonal challenges, interpersonal dynamics. It really does go to the ways that our larger institutions relate to individuals. And then finally, the white gaze, and then the white gaze of development, more specifically as coined by Dr. Robtel Paley, is a process where people and societies are viewed under the scope of white ethnocentrism, which assumes that whiteness and those and more broadly Westernness to be superior and to be the reference point for progress. And so the way that we might see this, and we're going to go into it in more depth, is that there's an assumption that those who are based in the global north are fundamentally better positioned, something intrinsic to them is superior. And that framework, that perspective, has then permeated all aspects of different sectors, including our own, unfortunately. And so viewing whiteness, viewing the West as the point of progress, and then inversely, the inference is that those who are non-white, those who are not from the West, not from the global north, are in fact lacking in progress and need to work to be more like those in the global north. And so these are just some key definitions for us to start off with to make sure that we're all on the same page. I'll pass it over to Dylan to summarize some of the key findings from our consultation before we move on to our discussion.
Thanks, Shannon. So I'm aware that only a few of you have read the full report, and I would encourage you, when you have the time, to look at some of the findings in either the executive summary or the main report. But what I'm going to try and do is summarize for you through this diagram, which is in the report, some of those key findings. But before I do that, I'd just like to say a few things about this report. The first is that it wasn't an easy report to write. And there are 3 main reasons for that. The first is that it was very difficult to do justice to a report which involved 160 participants around the world, really sharing very candidly their own experiences of racism, overt racism and structural racism, as well as the diversity of perspectives. So that, you know, produced a transcript of over 120 pages. And so this report really is a snapshot of a very full, very comprehensive, very candid conversation over 3 days. The second reason this was a difficult report to write is that, you know, Peace Direct is a Global North INGO, and we are part of the system. We're very, very aware that we have unintentionally inherited some of those structural racist policies, practices, ways of working. And so there was a level of discomfort, I think, about us being able to talk about this because we are part of this system. And the third reason is that we don't consider ourselves the experts in all of this. In fact, you know, I had a very a series of conversations with my team before we produced this report, saying, are we best placed to do this? Are we really, can we really say that we have, we're the best organization to be able to share this information with? And the answer is no, we're not. There are fantastic activists in the Global South who are very articulate about this. What we wanted to do was make a contribution to that conversation. We are on that journey ourselves. We have a lot to learn, and we have made mistakes, and we hope that by opening that up and by actually admitting that we are part of on that journey as well, we hope that might be an invitation to you all to think about how you might be able to improve your practice as well. So with those caveats in mind, I just wanted to draw your attention to this diagram. So this diagram summarizes what we think are some of the key findings that came out of the consultation. And it's how structural racism shows up in the work that we do right now. And it starts with those attitudes. So right in the center of the diagram are these attitudes around the superiority of our knowledge, our own professionalization, and also the way in which we still, overtly or otherwise, still consider those in the Global South as having lacking capacity. Now, even the best of us may fall into that trap. We may still think of ourselves as operating neutrally, having a level of expertise and knowledge that others don't. And the participants roundly rejected the idea that people in the sector, particularly those in the Global North, are operating neutrally. They said that was a fiction, and that actually we have to recognize that for them, for people in the Global South, they see this as a lineage going back many, many decades. And actually there's a history there that we have to acknowledge, whether or not we want to. We have to acknowledge that history influences how they see us and how we operate in those contexts. So there was a very strong rejection of this idea that we as a sector are neutral actors in this space. Now, those attitudes then feed into a number of different areas, and you can see them here. And I'm going to only talk about a few of them because I want us to have I hope that we can have a conversation about this. But the first I'd like to talk to you about is around organizational strategies. So INGO organizational strategies are built on the assumption that Indigenous civil society isn't up to doing the job itself. Now, that was something that came out of the consultation time and time again. This assumption that INGOs are best placed to be operating in those areas, and that they have somehow this expertise that they can then impart upon local communities. And I remember one consultation participant saying, there's so much value placed on expertise that comes from the outside, but no one values contextual expertise that we have. So we are the context experts, and yet people don't value that in the same way as they value technical expertise. So this sort of almost cult of expertise and the cult of professionalization that it dominates the INGO landscape has meant that INGO strategies talk about increasing their footprint, increasing their reach, increasing their income, and growth then becomes a dominant feature of INGO organizational strategies, when actually, at the same time as all these INGOs have grown, civil society in the Global South has blossomed and has grown and has proliferated. So actually, we should be thinking, and as many consultation participants said, we should be thinking about how to shift that power and the resources to Indigenous civil society. But yet INGO strategy is still very much entrenched in a sort of capitalist mindset, which is growth, extending our footprint, extending our reach. And that's highly problematic, I think, for activists in the global south who say, you know, we can stand on our own 2 feet, and actually we have the ability and we have the agency to be able to do the job. We're not given the opportunity to do the job. So that's one way in which structural racism is showing up. It's in those organizational strategies. I'm not going to talk about knowledge generation because I know that I'm sure that's going to come up in the conversations that we're about to have. So let me talk about the language. So we've talked about how important language is in terms of those definitions, but the activists were very vocal about how language disempowers them. So they still hear from the sector that the same language being used to deny them agency, to deny that they have a role to play in their own communities. So they mentioned the term beneficiaries. None of this is new, but you know, the term beneficiaries that they said has to be retired. It gives and reinforces the idea that they are only there to receive handouts from others. They criticized, even during the consultation, they criticized the use of the word aid. They said aid, the whole concept of aid and the terminology that's used should be retired, and we should be thinking about other terms like international cooperation or solidarity, which some organizations already use. But something that tries to remove this huge chasm of between global north and global south. And they talked about capacity development, or capacity building. So this constant reference to a lack of capacity that global south actors have, and that global north actors are there to develop their capacity. So that comes again from this sort of deficit model, which is that there is something lacking in the global south. And this language still, decades after it was first raised, is still permeating throughout the sector. And part of it is just laziness, I think. Part of it is that we haven't asked global south actors, what language should we be using? And that was our invitation to global south actors as well, was let's start to think about what language is the right language to use. And then I'd like to talk very briefly about funding. So so many of the participants talked about how funding, they are excluded from funding mechanisms. Those calls for proposals that are released intentionally exclude global south actors. Now, global north donors will talk about that in terms of fiduciary risk. They'll talk about due diligence processes, compliance measures, and yet all of that, in a sense, what the participants were saying is a bit of a smokescreen. Underlying that, they were saying, ultimately, you don't trust us. You know, we don't have the same level of trust as global north actors, and as a result, we're denied access to funding opportunities. And they mentioned that the really problematic link between the funding, the structural racism as it's seen in funding, to the relationships that are held between global north actors and donors. They said that in many cases, they understand that it's about who you know that really determines how funding is awarded. So they talked, some activists talked about the cozy conversations that will happen in country offices between donors and country representatives, which then give them the head start in terms of knowing what those calls for proposals will be like, or even worse, that those calls for proposals will be written for a particular INGO. Now, we all know this happens. This is something that's deeply embedded in our system. Even if there are certain donors who are trying to be less tied to certain to INGOs, there is still this dominance of relationships between donors and INGOs, which means that there's very little opportunity for local actors to participate in and really start to chart their own path with funding relationships directly with those donors. So those are three areas where this sort of overt and structural racism is really feeding into aspects of the sector which have really not changed over the last 20 years. And of course, there are many other areas that I could have talked about in terms of how recruitment is still biased, how fundraising still dwells on this lack of agency of local actors. And organizational structures, which we talk about in the report around the dominance of a type of model around country offices. None of this is easy to dismantle, but the point the activists were raising with us was we've got to acknowledge that structural racism exists, and we've got to be able to acknowledge that it exists in many forms so that we can start to do something about that. And up until very recently, there hasn't even been an acknowledgement that structural racism exists, or even that overt racism exists within the sector. So I'm going to leave it at that, because I know that there is, we want to have a conversation about this, but I would, as I said, I encourage you to have a look at some of the specific findings in the report, because they go into more detail about how this manifests in the system and what we can do about it.
Great. No, thank you very much, Dylan. And indeed, we do want to preserve some time so that we can allow our audience to ask questions as well. Although I'm gonna kick it off with a few of my own, just to get the ball rolling. And I want to pick up on what you just actually ended there, Dylan, and maybe allow Shannon to maybe come back into conversation, because what struck me about the report in the very beginning was the title, "Time to Decolonize Aid." And as you said, these are issues that have been with us, with the sector, with society for decades, if not even millennia. What is it about now? What is the moment that you are referring to? Why is now the time to decolonize aid? What has changed about the conversation that is allowing us now to wrestle with these issues?
I think that's such a rich question, and as difficult as it is, a lot of this is a result of the Black Lives Matter movement that we saw last summer. I think these conversations have been happening. As Dylan mentioned, there are incredible academics and activists who have been leading these efforts and trying to raise the sounding cry on issues of race and racism and discrimination in the sector. But I think it felt incredibly taboo to discuss blatantly matters of race. And then following the events of last summer and following the conversations that were being generated immediately afterwards, it was a unique opportunity for people to say, actually, this is something that I've also experienced. Actually, I saw a number of practitioners from the Global South online on social media saying, actually, me too. I've also experienced this sort of discrimination. I've also been made to feel small and as if I don't matter. And so really, we as an organization have been thinking about what it means to trust, to fund, to allow those most proximate to conflict to lead for nearly 20 years now. And we have come up again and again against these barriers when we're talking to our peer organizations or talking to multilaterals or talking to governments, which is, oh, well, there's so many challenges when it comes to funding locally, funding local peace builders, funding local practitioners. And we have tried to find ways to justify, well, it's effective, it's sustainable, all of these things. And one thing that we as an organization have increasingly realized that we haven't said is, why are you so hesitant to fund? What is it about local communities that is leading you to not trust them? Why do you believe them so fundamentally to be incapable of managing challenges or money or take their own strategies and allow them to lead? So we really are just fitting together this moment and our own realizations. And I think the localization agenda is, I think, in its 5th year following the Grand Bargain Agreement, and we're seeing it's not doing all of the things that we were hoping that it would. And so again and again, so many things are pointing to the fact that there's just this very obvious, very difficult thing that exists in our sector that we have been trying really hard to not talk about for a very long time, and we simply can no longer afford to do so.
No, thanks. That definitely provides some helpful context. I think something that you said just now that really triggered me was this idea of trust, about perhaps the lack of trust that it exposes within powerful organizations or powerful actors in some of the smaller organizations. And it kind of bumps up against another trend that I've been seeing in our sector, which has become increasingly motivated to present itself as evidence-based, to present itself as informed by data, informed by heavy research, evaluations, almost to the point where it's not just about informing the strategy, but it's about justifying that strategy, demonstrating that we have the information we need, and knowledge generation is important for helping us move our strategies and our programs forward. And I want to hear from you, maybe turning now to Dylan. Can you tell us a little bit about how this drive for evidence, how this urgency to report, to document, to evaluate, how this general push towards knowledge generation is also itself kind of an avenue of power that we need to look at.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, well, during the consultation, there was a lot of conversation around knowledge generation. And I think I mentioned already one activist and how he said, you know, we are the contextual experts, but no one values that in the same way as others value the technical expertise that is brought in from outside. I think there is a real problem around the dominance of knowledge, where that knowledge is being generated right now. And this is where this came up time and time again across the 3 days, that participants said, you know, who is it that's generating the knowledge? It's mostly global North actors. Even if it's about our country X or country Y, the knowledge that is being generated by people outside that country, and that is then being consumed by people in the global North. So the problem that they were identifying was twofold. First was it's around the knowledge generators. The knowledge generators being largely outside those contexts, and that there's not enough investment being put in country, despite the fact actually that there are an abundance of organizations and universities in the global South that are trying to produce and generate their own knowledge, but are being starved of the funds to do that in the same way as global North actors are. So there's first around the global North domination of knowledge. But the second thing was about the consumption of that knowledge. They said, well, you know, let's just accept that the majority of the knowledge is being produced in the global North. We can't even have access to some of it because it's not in our languages. Think about the number of times that we've produced reports, and I say this at Peace Direct, how many times Peace Direct has produced reports and only produced it in one other language, or only produced it in English. So the consumption of knowledge is also highly problematic in that it's not reaching communities and activists who could use it the most. So this strange kind of virtuous cycle of knowledge being generated in the global North for global North actors to then support global North activities that are being done in the global South. And actually that needs to be broken down and actually fundamentally changed to shift towards, you know, some global South consumption and production and consumption. But in terms of the accountability, you asked the question around accountability and this drive towards more evidence. I mean, that in itself, the participants were talking about as highly problematic, because it's, you know, who are we accountable to? A lot of that knowledge is being generated because in the eyes of the participants, the implementers, the INGOs, are accountable to the donors. They have to demonstrate their added value to the donors, and they have to demonstrate impact. And yet so much of that is not about being accountable to local communities. And we've all talked about this. We all know about, and we all use the right language, right? So we all talk about being more accountable, downward accountability being the thing, accountable to communities. But in practice, that doesn't happen. So there's a huge chasm between the rhetoric and the practice. And we need to start thinking about, what do local communities define as success? And how can we push back against this, what I've described as sort of tyrannical M&E approach, which is that more and more hoops that global South actors have to jump through for almost no benefit, really, really just simply so that global North donors can satisfy themselves internally, or the taxpayer, that actually the money is being spent well, rather than actually being truly transformational for local actors.
No, it's obviously a very hard-hitting issue, and I think that speaking these hard-hitting issues out loud and making ourselves, confront them is a very valuable exercise. I'm aware that we are approaching Q&A time. I had another question, but I'm inclined to let our participants also join in and be part of that conversation. So if there's another moment, I'll bring that up next. I'll bring up my other question next. But at this time, I do want to put the audience on notice that if you have been triggered by anything that's been discussed already, if you had particular questions about the report, its aims, its generation, now is your opportunity. There are two ways to ask questions. You may first raise your hand. That's down at the bottom of your screen. There's an icon that raises your hand. When I see you in the participants list of having raised your hand, I will call on you. At that point, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and go ahead and speak your question aloud directly to Dylan and Shannon. Be aware that if you do that, you will be recorded you will be captured in the recording. So if you are not comfortable with being captured in the recording, you may also submit a question anonymously to the KPSRL Secretariat. So simply open up your chat and write a direct message to the KPSRL Secretariat, and Melissa will be able to relay those questions without having you needing to make yourself visible. With that, I'm going to move to my next question, as I am not yet seeing any hands, which is fine. So,
Megan, sorry to interrupt you. We did actually get an anonymous question.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Go right ahead.
Okay, so the question is, can the panelists talk about the difference between localization and decolonization a little bit?
I'm happy to start, and then Dylan, feel free to hop in. So localization as an agenda really sought to fund directly to local practitioners, and so there were numbers set out as to the percentage of all international funds that would go directly to local actors, and the whole point was really to critique the ways that so many of these programs were run and led far from the context that they were really seeking to serve. Now, localization doesn't grapple with the history of these power relations and doesn't really grapple with the issue of power in the way that decolonizing does. The decolonizing movement, and I prefer the term movement rather than agenda, because really and truly all of us are involved, and there are different ways to be involved, and there are no tangible targets as there might be for the localization agenda in per se, but what we are calling for is, as Dylan mentioned, that acknowledgement first and foremost, that structural racism is real, that overt racism is real, and that people are not only suffering, both people who we are seeking to serve as well as people that we are working with, but also that our work is suffering as a consequence of it. And then also recognizing these power dynamics and recognizing the fact that race is something that we have biases and we are not addressing them, and that is again a limitation. And so they're both seeking to shift power, but one is more so focusing on this notion of local, and even then there are questions as to who constitutes a local person within certain contexts, and decolonizing is really trying to talk about more on an international scale, what does it mean to recognize our past and try and shift power and redress things for our future.
Great. I think that was really succinct. Dylan, did you have any additions to that, or?
Just very briefly to say, I think the participants in the consultation really were concerned about localization because they said that it has become a technocratic exercise that really doesn't address those deeper rooted issues that Shannon mentioned. But also their concern was that localization is being spun, sort of reframed by certain INGOs who then want to claim themselves to be local. In other words, the term itself is being watered down so that, for example, a country office of an INGO, which employs a certain number of local staff, can call itself a local entity. And the local practitioner said, you're not. You still get your money from Global North, you still dominate the landscape in terms of the funding, and you're still then competing with local entities. Your strategy is still subordinate to a Global North strategy. Therefore, you're not truly local. So there was a concern that not only through the technocratic exercise, but also that the reframing of localization is largely meaningless now. And actually, we should think much more radically in terms of that. Now, of course, not everyone agreed with that, but there was some strong voice to say there are problems with how localization has currently been implemented.
Thanks for that extra additional context. That really that does bring up, I think, something that a lot of us probably need to wrestle with. I'm going to hand over then to Frank Housing. Frank, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Frank Housing. I work at the Dutch MFA, the Stabilization and Humanitarian Aid Department. I'm halfway to report, so maybe you address this, but thanks for the excellent report and the excellent presentation. I was wondering, we might need to change the system. But many of us are working inside the system. If you are, for example, working inside the system and you're managing programs at Foreign Ministry, Development Ministry, as many of us here do, what are the ways to push back against the system or work within your program to change the norms a little bit from the inside, while still acknowledging that the entire system might need to change? But if you're inside the system, how do you push it? Thanks.
I'll start with that and hand over to Shannon. Frank, thank you for that great question. Well, first, and we have some specific recommendations, as you know, within the report. You know, for those within the system, and particularly those who hold power in the bilaterals, I think there is a huge opportunity to shift the system. And I think the first thing that we've recommended for all stakeholders, whether you're an activist, whether you're an NGO practitioner, or whether you're a donor, is to acknowledge that structural racism exists, to actually have that conversation within your own department, have that conversation within your own team and within the organization. It's still a taboo. I mean, Shannon talked about it being a taboo up to very recently. I think it's still a taboo. I think there are certain governments and certain departments who just don't want to have that conversation. Now, if that conversation isn't happening, we can't hope for the transformation that we think is necessary and long overdue. So acknowledge that structural racism exists, and then start to have the uncomfortable conversations about power. People don't talk about power. People don't talk about who holds the power and why it is being retained by those who have it. Now, for some actors, there may well be very good reasons why power is still retained. So the money that is being accumulated by certain private philanthropic organizations, but that is no excuse for not to talk about power and how it is wielded by those stakeholders, and to actually open a conversation with your grantees to see how they experience it. I think it has to start with those conversations about power and structural racism, because everything else, if we don't mention those, everything else is almost window dressing. We can talk around the subject, we can tinker around the edges of the system, rather than actually saying the system is fundamentally built on some problematic assumptions that are very deep rooted. Let's get to those first. Let's open it up and ensure, we hope that senior leadership within those organizations, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, can be brave enough to actually acknowledge some of those, because then you can have a much richer conversation about what needs to change. But if there's no acknowledgement of those issues in the first place, I think we are left, in a sense, a bit like the localization agenda. It becomes a bit of a technocratic exercise. Shannon, anything else to add?
Yeah, I think Dylan talked, and I think I'm grateful, you know, at Peace Direct we have leadership that values this issue and is really pushing for it. And that's an incredible privilege. But even if we didn't, there are ways that we could continue to move this agenda forward. And I do want to bring some of them up, because I think sometimes people feel as though if they don't have board buy-in, if they don't have their CEO, you know, talking about structural racism, then there's nothing that they can do. And that's not true. I mean, with our colleagues, very, very simply, transition away from using the term beneficiary. Immediately, that acknowledges the capacity, the skills, and the agency of local partners. So there are simple ways to make linguistic changes, as well as creating opportunities for local partners to meet with you and say, we have been in relationship, and I want to be clear, when we are funding somebody, we are entering into a relationship with them. When we are funding an organization, that is a relationship. And so we need to view it as such. When, say, we've been in relationship with you for 5 years now, 2 years now, 6 months, where can we change? Where can we better meet you where you are? I think the COVID-19 pandemic was incredibly difficult and changed a lot of things. And we saw a lot of us change our reporting requirements and just all of the paperwork that we would put onto local organizations and ask them to meet those standards. We changed those. We were able to simplify those. So even in your position, especially if you hold a degree of leadership, as we're entering a new period in COVID-19 and the pandemic, I see a lot of organizations shifting back to these really, really difficult frameworks and modalities that and simply local organizations cannot meet them. And so how can we hold on to the lessons that we learned and the ability and know and say, well, a year ago we learned that we actually don't need all of this. So how can we maintain those things? So there are ways that even you as an individual can actually change the system within your own organization, within your team even, and those matter. Those small incremental changes also matter, as well as everything that Dylan said about, you know, trying to shift things from a larger scale. But I really do want to emphasize you can change things as well, and really should if this is something you're committed to.
I really appreciate that reflection as well, specifically on the idea of being in relationship with your partners, because that brings it very closely to an interpersonal and therefore a personal responsibility of how are you honoring that relationship and how are you understanding that relationship, in terms of the dynamics between people. Anna, I see you next. I do want to acknowledge that we have 3 anonymous questions that will follow you, but I'm going to give you the floor now, and then after that we'll turn to the anonymous questions. Go ahead, Anna.
That sounds good. Thank you very much, Megan. Hi, everyone. I have a question, which would be more, if you can say a bit more about how the report has been received so far. What sort of reactions have you got? Because as you said, a lot of those conversations can be rather uncomfortable, and it touches as well upon the work of some INGOs, which are colleagues in the sector. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that. And I know that you've tried to start having those conversations by launching some ideas on Twitter and things like that. So I'd be curious to hear in general how it's been received. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Shannon, would you like to?
Sure. I will say, following the immediate publication of the report in May of this year, from people in the Global South, we received a number of people who were saying, great, it's so fantastic that this conversation is happening. We received a number of people saying this conversation actually is limited. There's all of these other things that you didn't have a chance to talk about. And we went, oh my goodness, that's true, which is why we're hosting follow-up conversations. And then from our colleagues, we received, it depends. A number of people said, thank you. I've been struggling with this for years. I've been in this sector for years. Thank you. I'm so glad we're talking about this. I'm so glad there's language now to talk about this. Or I didn't realize. I really believe that we're in this work because we care. And so a number of colleagues really reached out and said, thank you. Now I have a new way to make sure that my work is actually doing what I think it's doing. We also received pushback from people. I've received pushback from people. I think as well, my name is Shannon Paige. My race is not mentioned on the report. I think a lot of people pushed back and said, well, as a white person, who are you to be leading this? And I think it points to a lot of the ways that people are really uncomfortable. A lot of people felt attacked. A lot of people felt like we were trying to discredit the decades of work that their organizations have done. That's not at all what we're trying to do. I think that's why Dylan, started off by saying we are not the experts and we have done wrong in the past. And part of our own process around this report is also speaking with our partners, speaking with our board, speaking with our other colleagues at Peace Direct and saying, how can we do better? And we like to bring that to the fore and say, we aren't perfect. We talk about privilege, we talk about benefiting from structural racism. I like to say I've benefited from structural racism. I have benefited from the white gaze and this privileging of certain perspectives. I sound incredibly American. I was educated in the United States. I speak English fluently. These are all privileges that have afforded me a degree of credibility, where I know some of our partners who perhaps might speak English with a French accent or another accent, or potentially, have a name that is less comfortable for those in the Anglophone world, they might not be afforded the same opportunities that I have been. And so I think really bringing that to the fore and making sure that people understand that we aren't critiquing individuals, we're critiquing a system. And if and when we are critiquing individuals, that is an invitation for people to change. It is not an attempt to cancel anybody. It is not an attempt to push anybody out of their work or out of the sector. It really is an invitation to say, how can we be better? Because we are all here because we actually care and we are trying to make this world better. So how can we do that most effectively? Dylan?
Just really to add to what Shannon said there, we really didn't know how this would land with the sector, and Shannon's very eloquently explained the sort of feedback we've received. One thing I would say is that we have been overwhelmed by the number of organizations who have written to us to say thank you for doing this and want to start on that journey. We didn't expect that. It's been really refreshing and very encouraging to see how some fairly well-established organizations have come to us and said, we need to get our house in order, we need to work on this. Because they understand that they've been operating for the same way for decades and they really haven't thought about these issues. I would say that the bilaterals, the governments have been slow, with the exception of, I don't mind mentioning it, but the US government has been extremely progressive in their thinking. So both USAID and various government departments, including the State Department, have reached out to us wanting to have some pretty deep conversations around how they can make some practical changes within the administration right now. Now, that took us completely by surprise. We would love to think that there are other governments out there that can do the same, and I'd encourage any of you who are on the call right now, if you're working for a government department, we'd love to talk to you, because you know, in terms of who holds power, some of these governments are so important within the system. And so we really need to reach them. But I think there's a lot more that we need to do, and a lot more conversation that needs to happen at that level. Right now, it seems to be happening at either the activist level or at the NGO level.
It's working its way up, hopefully. That's hopefully the idea. I'm going to turn now to Melissa, because Melissa, I believe you have some questions that have been submitted anonymously. So why don't you go ahead and speak those aloud?
Yes. So one of them mentioned that their question was actually answered, but maybe worthwhile mentioning that there are people in this call who are also really seeking these tangible actions that we can do today that would be useful. But I'll raise an anonymous question here to both of you. The question is, with the geographical definitions of global south and north that were shared, is there a danger of essentializing or invisibilizing power dynamics and privileges which exist within and across the global north and south? For example, De Sousa Santos highlights that there is a global south in the north, and that we should be thinking of the south as rather a metaphor for the human suffering caused by capitalism and colonialism on the global level, as well as the resistance to overcoming or minimizing such suffering.
Absolutely. No, I mean, global north and global south are catch-all terms that we use just quite broadly, but the anonymous question poser is absolutely right. There are these complexities of power that we really need to get into, and I think that's why I brought up the term intersectionality, because it really does matter. Even within, Europe, there are different communities that hold different powers and have had different power relationships historically that do continue to influence the way that they relate to one another and the way that aid and development functions within those communities. And so we would never presume to say it's as simple as just drawing across, the northern hemisphere holds all the power and the southern hemisphere holds none, but rather I think the geographic definition that we used is just helpful sometimes visually for people to understand that when we say global north, we're referring to places such as North America, Europe, certain parts of Europe, certain parts of North America. Let's be clear, let's be specific, as well as Japan tends to be a country that's drawn into the definition of global north, but really it is more complex than simple geography, and really that's why it's important when we're talking about the global south to consider, do you have a history of engaging or being forced to engage with colonialism and suffering through imperialism, slavery, so on and so forth. So I'm really glad that they raised that, because that's an incredibly rich addition and very necessary.
Great, thank you. And Megan, should I move on to the other anonymous question, and then hopefully we have time for Lena's question? I see her hand.
Exactly, that would be great.
Okay, great. So this question is, how can an organization move from localization or quote international to a more global organization where different parts of the organization are placed in different parts of the world, collaborate in a more equitable work frame?
It's a great question. I think one of the recommendations that we have in the report is that organizations, particularly those in the global north, should be considering or adopting a transition mindset. And by that we mean that we still have organizational structures that haven't really changed and aren't fit for purpose anymore. We still have head offices based in the global north. We have country offices scattered over the global south, largely still managed by global north practitioners, and a strategy that comes from the global north to the global south country offices hasn't changed for over 50 years and has a long history, as we talk about in the report. There are transition strategies that can be adopted where, as you've just described, or the question alludes to, where you can create decentralized structures. You could reinvent yourself as an organization which is actually has no center of power or multiple centers of power, so that you don't just have this very sort of pyramid type structure, which is what we have right now. There are examples of INGOs that have completely exited and have transitioned to local leadership. And by local leadership, meaning actually allow those organizations or the country offices to become their own independent entities. So we conducted some research over the last 3 years, and we produced a book called What Transformation Takes. It's available free online, and it shows about 18 case studies of how organizations have changed their ways of operating to enable local leadership to really thrive. Now, that's really, I think, a sort of tip of the iceberg in terms of the kind of research that's necessary. So we're spending another 3 years looking at organizational models to answer that very question. To answer the question, how can INGOs that have been very traditionally structured for so long change the way that they are structured and governed to become much more distributed in terms of their power and their governance and their ownership. And we hope that we can come back to the person who asked that question in a few years' time and be able to give some more practical examples. But there already are examples out there, and so I would encourage the person who asked the question to have a look at the book. And we hope that there will be some INGOs brave enough to take those steps. We at Peace Direct are trying to think about that for ourselves, because we are very traditionally structured as well. So we are, you know, as we have produced this report, we're thinking about what does this mean for us as an organization, and how could we reimagine ourselves as a different type of organization, potentially a network, or potentially a constellation of actors and activists. So it's an exciting time to be thinking about these things, and we shouldn't feel threatened by it. But I do think that there's an institutional inertia within the sector that prevents us from having those creative conversations. And there is this push, as I mentioned earlier on, this push for growth and dominance and reach and increasing our footprint that really stops us from thinking creatively about how we could reinvent ourselves and reinvent the sector.
Excellent. Well, excellent things to look forward to in terms of the next frontier of where your research is going, and some practical advice that might be able to follow. I'm going to hand over now to Lina Maria. I see that you've been waiting patiently with your hand up. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I was thinking on how are we thinking on bringing these kind of conversations within national governments, because the thing that we are facing right now is that international organizations are working in our countries, giving support to national governments, providing technical assistance. And the thing is, national governments are now replicating the same practices with local initiatives. So there's like a conflict in that part, because even when local initiatives and local led processes knows and they are fully empowerment on this idea that we need to decolonize these processes, we are having difficulties because national government are replicating the same practices. So I think it's important to think of how to involve national governments in this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Lina Maria. I think one of the things that was mentioned in the consultation, which I think was pretty sobering to hear, was how global South actors have incorporated the framing, the worldview of global North actors themselves. So we talked earlier about that there's these crude definitions of North and South anyway, global North and global South, but actually what some of the participants were saying is that they've in effect drunk the Kool-Aid. You know, as global South activists, they see global North actors as hugely successful, hugely influential, having all the money. So actually they start to mimic those organizations and their worldview. And what that means is that they then look at their own communities through those lenses and actually use the same language which disempowers local actors. So it's exactly as you said, Lina Maria, in terms of how the influence of global North actors not only influences how global South NGOs operate, but also how global South governments operate as well. And that this sort of mindset is very, very difficult to shift. So in answer to your question, I mean, we do absolutely see that there needs to be much more effort placed on engaging with global South governments. And one of the problems we find right now is that even the decolonizing conversation is being dominated, and we are part of this problem potentially, is that dominated by actors in the global north. The demand side, in terms of, you know, local actors being able to stand up and say this is a problem, is not there yet. And part of the reason it's not there yet is because, and we heard this directly from local actors, is when those who have been brave enough to talk about structural racism and the inequities in the system have been shut out and shut down, they've been vilified because the conversation is just too difficult for some donors, policymakers to accept, to understand, to digest. And so they find themselves cut out of conversations. So right now you have, I think, a burgeoning conversation happening in the global north, which I think is a good thing. We need to be able to support and encourage those actors who really want to talk about it, but are afraid to do so because they feel that they'll be punished in doing so, to really stand up and be able to say it, and then for them to be able to engage with global South governments. But it's going to take an awful lot of effort, and we're far from that right now. Shannon, would you like to add anything on that?
I think I'd just like to exemplify a little bit how we could do that. So I think a lot of these conversations, Linda Maria, as you know, they're happening in these circles that Dylan mentioned, but when they're happening in these circles, all of our organizations, all of our governments then go and relate to governments in the global south. And so if we can hold our own organizations and the partnerships that we have with bilaterals to a certain standard and say, actually, we need this degree of representation for us to feel comfortable, you know, entering into partnership with you, so on and so forth, that's going to shift the needle. And so that's a top-down pressure that's going to be put on governments around the world. And then I also think we need a bottom-up pressure, and that's going to come from, you know, people like you, people like myself, who are able to speak to our own governments. So that here we are speaking to the US government and saying, hey, these are actually values that not only do we hold, but they're more effective. And so how can we have both the top-down and bottom-up pressure to get local governments all over the world to actually start to consider this not only necessary if they want to be quote-unquote relevant on the global stage, but also necessary if they want their efforts to be effective and to be credible and recognized at home. And so I think that's, again, Dylan's point, incredibly difficult, and we're far from it. But every time we have one of these conversations, and every time we get more and more people to be willing to acknowledge structural racism and the value of dismantling the existing structures as we've created them, we're getting closer and closer to that point where there's going to be both this top-down pressure and this bottom-up pressure. So I'm hopeful.
It's good to come around to a hopeful note. I just want to say that we are creeping up on 5 o'clock. So those of you who have other commitments, it is understood that that you anticipated an hour. I'm going to ask a little bit of generosity from Shannon and Dylan if you would be willing to stay for slightly longer. I know we have one more question. To those who are not able to stay longer, we understand and we bid you a fond farewell for the time being. And also to say that we do intend to wrap up in no more than, let's say, 5 or 10 minutes, just to not to push anyone's clock too much further. Melissa, why don't you go ahead? There was one last anonymous question.
We had one more anonymous question. The question is it possible to decolonize, or should we be looking towards abolitionist frameworks?
I am happy to start with this question because it is one that, as Dylan knows, I have grappled with quite intensely and I continue to grapple with. So fantastic question, incredibly difficult question. Thank you for raising it. I think as things stand, it would be negligent to rush towards an abolitionist framework. I think the ways that we have created this system, if we were to remove ourselves, because again, obviously I'm sorry to whoever's ever asking the question, I'm not quite sure particularly what branch of abolitionism that you're subscribing to, but for the most part, as I've seen it when we're talking about aid and development, it's the removal of external forces. And frankly, we have simply not created a system where local organizations are funded and are supported as they need to be in order for abolition and the removal of foreign entities to actually be feasible without there being really dramatic and drastic suffering as a consequence. And so we can't just leave, you know, we have created the system where, and as uncomfortable as it is to acknowledge, there is a degree of dependency on the global north, and we have created it to be that way. And so for us to then remove ourselves, that dependency, there's going to be a vacuum that is not going to be met. And so rather, that's why we talk about a transition mindset in the report. It's really thinking about, well, how can we make sure that if and when foreign entities do remove themselves from these positions, how can we do so in a way that isn't going to negatively impact the communities that we are working with? I also want to emphasize that in the consultation, a conversation that really generated a lot of comments and was really, really rich was this notion of, well, to what degree should aid and the broader aid sector even be considered aid, or to what degree should it be considered reparations? And so I think within this abolitionist framework, that's also something that I think we should be talking about. Now, I do want to say that I think it's quite dangerous to rush to qualifying anything as reparations, because for reparations to happen, they're beyond the acknowledgement that our organizations are doing. We need formerly colonial governments to also acknowledge that they benefited from colonialism, imperialism, slavery, and then that what used to be termed aid and what we could now refer to as reparations is a direct consequence and a direct attempt to remedy the harm that was caused because of those institutions. Now, we have not seen that. And even though there are a lot of ways in which former colonial powers and the aid flows that they have with the wider world tend to map perfectly onto former colonial maps, that has little to do with, we can't call that reparations because there's no overt acknowledgement. And so really and truly, I think this notion of what does abolition look like for the aid sector, it's an incredibly complex one. It's one that I know at PSRL are going to continue grappling with and welcome ongoing conversations around it. But I think whether or not we decide to move from using terminology like aid and moving to something more along the lines of reparations, we are still in the very early stages of it. And I think, frankly, even getting people to acknowledge racism is something that is very, very new. And to Dylan's point, some people are still not willing to do so. And so I think a lot of people, when they hear the word abolition, might shut down and get quite fearful. So I know that's another reason why that conversation is often stalled. So a long, complex answer to say, I don't know. We're all thinking it through, but some of the considerations I wanted to share with you all today.
I'd just like to add a final thought on that. In the consultation, as Shannon mentioned, there were some people who were talking about reparations. There was not a single participant, as far as I can remember, that was asking or requesting for the end of aid or the end of international cooperation. They recognize that there's international solidarity and international cooperation is mutually beneficial, and that actually they don't want to be put on a pedestal and to be for the world to say that local actors have all the answers and have all the resources. They want to learn from others, but they want to do it within a completely different framework. And so thinking about it in terms of international solidarity and thinking and for international actors to be more humble about their own added value was really, really important. So for all of us around this table, this virtual table, who care so much about the work that we do, the invitation and the request from participants was, we want and we need international cooperation and solidarity, and we want to be engaging with our friends and colleagues around the world, but we just want that to be remade within a different framing, and that's what we need to do. So I don't think abolition was at all mentioned, and I think that there's a lot of benefit that can still be gained from having those interactions that we all care about and benefit from, and that we all believe that will make those communities and countries, prosperous and thriving and safe for the people who live in it. So we hope that over the coming 12 months, we'll continue to deepen those conversations and really understand what a reimagined system can look like. But we don't have the answers. So, it's an invitation to you all also to continue the conversation with us as well.
Excellent. A great carrying forward point. I'm going to start bringing the meeting to a close, first by giving our very sincere and heartfelt appreciation to Dylan and Shannon for the work that you are doing, for the conversations that you're carrying out, for the challenges that you're putting in front of us to wrestle with. It is, in solidarity, a benefit to us all. And I also want to mention that the work that you will be continuing to do will also provide us with another opportunity to engage you. This year's KPSRL annual conference, which is happening on October 14th, will also feature a session wherein Peace Direct will focus specifically on decolonizing the peacebuilding sector, which I think is a really unique and particular conversation that many of us might here in the call find very relevant. So please be aware of that, and if you're interested in joining, please register for the conference. With that, I'm going to ask that if anyone has further questions that they are really eager to address to Dylan or Shannon, we will be sharing contact details so that you can reach out. And I really want to encourage everyone to read the report. I think today there was quite a lot of excellent discussion around the urgency, around the moment, about the concepts in general, but there are also in the report really practical and focused actions that can be taken. And I know that for some people that's really important for them to feel that they have a hook into how to move forward. So I encourage you all to go ahead and find the report and read it. And last plug, you'll see on your screen now a QR code. This is taking you to a survey for this session. We absolutely are committed to learning, and we do learn a great deal after every session about how we can do better, what we can do to serve you, what are you appreciating. So we would love it if you would be able to fill out the survey. It takes 3 minutes, and we go through the answers very carefully to try our best to continue to meet your needs as our participants and our community here at the Knowledge Platform for Security and Rule of Law. So with that, one more very grand thank you to Shannon and Dylan, and to Melissa for all of her expertise in technical hosting. And we will see you all in the next session, we hope.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.